When it comes to assessing mental capacity, you'll often hear about something called the two-stage test. So what is it and how do we apply it? Let's find out. So in the UK, the Mental Capacity Act gives us a framework which has come to be called the two-stage test. Now, the object of this framework is to help practitioners to understand what they're looking for when it comes to the assessment of mental capacity. And it's called the two-stage test because, cunningly, it's actually in 3 stages. So let's look at each of those stages in turn and see where it leads us. Now, the Act in section 2.1 starts off by asking a question. And that question is there an impairment to the functioning of the mind or the brain? Now, this is sometimes called the diagnostic test. And I'm afraid to say that's a misleading title and one that I've successfully argued against in court. What the Act is asking for is not a diagnosis. It's asking if there's the presence of an impairment. Now, you might be saying to me, like the barrister did in court, well, what's the difference between the two? So an impairment is when something isn't working properly, when something is not functioning correctly. A diagnosis, on the other hand, is a label that we give to a series of symptoms that have been present for a period of time. Let me give you an example. So let's say there's a woman with dementia. Now, she didn't get that label of dementia immediately. She'd been forgetful, she'd been putting the cat in the microwave for 6 months, and it was a combination of these factors that led to that diagnosis. But it doesn't mean that before she got the diagnosis, she didn't have an impairment. It just means we hadn't given it a label. And you can think about that as well when it comes to stuff like alcohol, when it comes to, drug misuse. When people are experiencing the effects of alcohol or drugs, you can clearly say there's an impairment, but they won't have received a formal diagnosis. So what we're looking for is not a diagnosis, but the presence of an impairment. And the Act then says, look, is that impairment sufficient that it impacts on our ability to do 4 things? Now, if there is no impairment, then we jump to the first principle. And if you haven't yet watched my video on the 5 principles, then please do. But if there is an impairment, then we move on to the next stage of the two-stage test. This is often called the functional stage. And it says that a person has to be able to do 4 things. They have to be able to understand relevant information. They have to be able to retain that relevant information. They have to be able to weigh up and use that relevant information. And they have to be able to communicate it back. Now, one of the key words there is relevant. There's something called the threshold of understanding. And this is the thing that makes capacity item specific. So the threshold of understanding is what you need to know to make a decision. And clearly, what I need to know to decide what to have for breakfast is very different to what I need to know to decide where to live or whether to make a will. And so what the Act says is you don't have to be able to understand everything. You just have to be able to understand the relevant and salient bits. Now, when we talk about understanding, what does that really mean? Now, if you Google it, probably the top answer that comes up is understanding means to understand something. Now, I don't know about you, but as a kid, I was always told that you're not supposed to use a word to describe itself. So if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see things such as judgment and, the ability to weigh up, the ability to apply knowledge and information. And that's what we're looking for when we're trying to determine if a person can understand the relevant information. Now, for me, one of the key things that I use to do that is questions. Not the questions I ask them, but it's the questions that they ask me. Because if I give people information, right? Let's say I was assessing somebody around their ability to take medication, and we might be talking about the side effects, and they go to him, I don't really know what the side effects are. So I give them that information, and I give them information about how often it should be taken and when it should be taken. Now, at that point, I'm waiting to see what questions they ask me, because the questions they ask me will tell me what they're doing with that information. So, for example, they might say, can I take it with liquid? Do I have to take it with food? What happens if I accidentally take too much, or if I miss something, if I miss a dose? If they don't ask me any questions, then that triggers in my head that there are 3 potential things going on here. Firstly, I haven't explained it well enough. Secondly, there's some sort of barrier, some sort of cognitive impairment going on that means that they're not able to understand what I'm telling them. Or 3, there's a barrier to their communication, which means they can't tell me or they can't ask me the questions they want to ask. So at that point, I will go through and I will unpick each one bit by bit to find out where the issue lays. So that's understanding. What about retention? Well, again, they only have to be able to retain the relevant information. So the fact that somebody doesn't know the name of their cat when we're talking to them about a will doesn't matter. But what does matter is about how long they're able to retain that information for. And one of the questions I get asked is, well, how long is that? Now, the Act, helpfully or unhelpfully, in the guidance tells us that that's for the length of the decision-making process. Well, how long is that? Surely, depending on a different question, depends on the different length of the decision-making process. And you're absolutely right. So there's another really helpful bit of case law. One of my favourite bits. It's called ABC versus XYZ. I love it because it's the sort of thing my 7-year-old would have come up with, right? And in that, the judge identifies that there are 2 different types of decisions. He talks about macro decisions and micro or one-off decisions. So the judge says, look, a macro decision is something like property and financial affairs, health and welfare, where actually the person is going to need to be able to make decisions on an ongoing basis. And those decisions might happen at any time without planning or without kind of pre-knowledge. And he contrasts those to one-off decisions. And these might be, do I eat a carrot? Do I make a will? A lasting power of attorney is another one-off. Gifting is considered another one-off decision. And so when it comes to that, and when it comes to those, and how long we need to remember information for, if it's a macro decision, and we're saying that actually this is an ongoing decision, and we need to take a more longitudinal view, then the length they have to be able to retain information is much, much longer than someone that's just doing a one-off, such as a will or an LPA. Because for a will or an LPA, if they don't know before I see them, if they can't remember information before I see them, I give them the information at the start of the assessment. They're able to understand that and retain that for the length of the time we're assessing. And then 10 minutes later, they forget it. Well, that doesn't matter. What matters is, could they retain it during the time that I was assessing them for? Now, we contrast that with the macro. Whereas, in fact, I then start looking for evidence of what were they like 6 months ago? What were they like 2 weeks ago? What were they like yesterday? Going forward, are they likely, more often than not, to be able to make this decision? And if they can't, more often than not, then we start to lean towards a lack of capacity. We then move on to the next element, which is to weigh up and use. Now, for me, this is really closely tied in with unwise decisions. Are they able to take that information and apply it, even if I don't agree with how they're applying it? Are they able to understand the risks and the consequences of either taking the action or not taking the action? Is there that logical series of steps to their thought that gets them to that body of evidence to the outcome? Finally, we then come on to communication. And it's really important that we don't conflate or confuse this with understanding. So often I'll see reports that say something like, he couldn't tell me the answer, therefore he didn't understand it. Well, that's not the case at all, right? Imagine if I put sellotape over your mouth, a bag on your head, put you in a straitjacket, okay? Some of you might get excited, but calm down. But then I was to ask you what your birthday is. You'll be able to tell me, but it doesn't mean that you haven't understood it. It doesn't mean that you've not been able to retain the information. It just means you haven't been able to communicate it back to me. And so when we're considering all 4 of those, the Act tells us if there's only one of those that you're not able to do, then it represents a lack of capacity. So that's the first stage and the second stage of the 2-stage test. But I said there were 3 stages. So there's something called the Causative Nexus. And that is the link between the impairment and a person's ability or inability to do those 4 things. Understand, retain, weigh up and communicate. What the Act tells us is there has to be a link. And if there isn't that link, then we jump to that first presumption, the presumption of capacity. Let me give you an example. So several years ago, I was asked to assess a lady. She was 60 years old. When she was 50, she'd been hit by a car. She had a brain injury and at the time been deemed unable to manage her property and finances. Now, 10 years later, she believes she's regained capacity and she's asking to be given access to her money again. Now, the solicitor that was looking after her money and who asked me to assess her, quite rightly raised a concern. He said, look, Tim, she's really, really impulsive, right? I'm really worried that if she gets access to her money, which was about 2 million after the accident payout, that she will blow the lot. So I did what we call the pre-morbid history. So I looked at what she was like beforehand. Now, when she was 24, she inherited £500,000. Guess how long it took her to spend that £500,000? If any of you thought 2 weeks, you're bang on. At the age of 24, her view of money was easy come, easy go. I might die tomorrow, therefore I want to enjoy it to its maximum now. So she bought first-class flights around the world, 5-star hotel, she bought herself a sports car. Boom, it was gone. So now we fast forward to when she's 60. And actually, the solicitor was right. She would blow the lot, but not because of an impairment to the functioning of the mind or the brain, not because of her brain injury, but because of her view on money. At 60, her view on money was still easy come, easy go. I might die tomorrow. And so it was felt at the end of the assessment that actually she had capacity because there was no causative nexus. Now, I hope that's been useful. I hope you now understand the two-stage test and how it all fits together. The only other thing I'm going to talk about now, very briefly, is actually about how we do it in practice. Because although the Code of Conduct has it starting at the diagnostic stage, working down to the functional stage, with that causative nexus in between, what the law actually tells us to do is to flip it on its head and do it the other way around. And that makes a lot of sense from a practical point of view. Because what you're doing then is you're saying, actually, does this person have difficulty in understanding this information? Are they not able to retain the information? Are they not able to weigh it up, or are they not able to communicate it? And clearly, if the answer to that is no, they're able to do all that stuff, well, you go, fine, they've got capacity. If you go, actually, there's an issue with one of those, then you start to go, well, where's that issue coming from? And you start to look for that causative nexus. What's causing it? And if that then takes you to an impairment that says, okay, there is, they have some sort of memory impairment that means they're not able to remember the information for even 2 minutes. Therefore, they can't use it to weigh it and apply it. What we find is that we have worked our way backwards through that test, if you like, to reach the decision about capacity. Look, I hope that has been useful. I hope you are kind of sitting there or going to walk away from this video going, right, I get that, I understand that. If you have found it useful, please do like and subscribe at the bottom. As I said, with all my videos, if there's anything specific you want me to talk about, then please do let me know. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you very much.